Sir,
Yeah.
so for the presentation part, we have an option below as present now.
Mm. Okay.
So
Present
from
now. Where do I find that option?
to the right side
Ah,
below your screen.
hold on. I need to. Yes. Present now, right? Okay. Yeah.
From there, we have that a window option.
Yeah. I have a window option. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And then we can show our PowerPoint presentation from there.
Okay. All right. So who goes first among the three speakers we have?
See,
I think Orijita and Indrani, right?
yes, sir. I
Okay.
think you'll be taking on the global perspective first.
Okay.
I think we were thinking that you would start.
Oh, okay. You want me to start? Fine. And what Arijita and Indrani will be covering each? I forgot you mentioned that.
Indrani ma'am will be taking on the health point of view,
Okay. All
and
right. Good.
Arjita ma'am will be taking on labor market labor market
All
participation
right.
point of view.
Okay. So I can start with the global
Yes, sir.
scenario, right?
Yes, yes.
And we'll go about 15 minutes, you said, right?
You can take a bit longer time.
Okay. All right. And if people ask questions, how do they ask? They
They will be putting it on the chat section to the extreme
chat
right of your
section.
stream, and after the
Oh, okay.
session,
Yeah, I see the chat sign. Yeah.
after all the presentations are over,
Hmm.
I'll be
You'll be
putting
then.
them to the
Yeah.
speakers accordingly. And
Okay. All right. Fine. Yeah. So during the presentation, um, can one see the chat questions coming and something that is
yes, definitely you can see.
relevant? I
To
can
the right
see,
of
right?
the screen, if you see on the top right corner, there's two options: people and chat. So if you click
Uh,
on the chat option, you can see all the people who are putting comments over there.
yes, yes, right. I see from Shoaib Ikram. Good afternoon. Yes. Okay. Right, right. Okay. Expressive, I must say. It- Technology makes a big difference. Yeah.
Currently, it's helping
Wow.
us a lot.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
connect
And
in such a precarious time.
I see 22 people are connected now. Is that
So
the
there's a
case?
limitation with this Google Meet. We can only connect up to 100 people here. But
Right.
we had almost 18 people willing to listen to us. So we will be live
Okay.
streaming this on YouTube too. So
Oh,
those who
okay.
cannot
So more
join over
people.
here will be joining
Right.
via YouTube live streaming. And their
Sure.
questions will
Sure.
be taken from YouTube chats and we will be passing it on to you and the other teachers.
Okay. Unless they are extremely complicated. uh, all right. So you can tell me when to go. I will then go to the present. Now I'll click on that. All right. We
we
still
can
have 6 minutes, right?
yes, we can have a mock test once.
Okay. Let me try that. Okay. So I see 4 windows it's giving me, which is from my computer. Hang on. Oh, wait a minute. Let me open my file and see. Is it coming? Share an application on window. Can you see this one?
Not yet. Yes, sir. Now
Yeah,
it has come.
yeah,
Yes.
the slide. Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Stop sharing. Fine. I think
Yes, sir. It stopped now.
it's stopped now.
Yes.
Okay. I hope this file is open. All right. Okay. So I need to now stop the presentation thing, isn't it? Oh, where is it?
Yes, it's already stopped now.
It's already stopped. Okay. All right. What is it there?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Please unmute yourself, please.
Yes, yes, your microphone.
বিভাসদা কেমন আছেন?
ভালো ভালো, তুমি ভালো আছো?
ভালো আছি।
আচ্ছা, অনেকদিন পর দেখা হলো।
একদম। আমাদের আরেকজন স্পিকার আছে?
No, ma'am. Indrani ma'am has not yet joined. I'm waiting for her.
আচ্ছা, শশী,
Yes, sir.
মানে ইংরেজিতেই বলা হবে, তাই তো?
So we have people joining from India, all across India and world.
Okay, so
Language barrier হয়ে যাচ্ছে এবার।
no, sure, I'll speak in English only then. But people can
They can
speak in any language.
They can question
Yeah.
in the language. Which
Yeah,
we are
yeah, yes,
aware
of course. Right.
ভুল করে লিভ হয়ে গেছিলাম। শশী? শশী?
ম্যাম বলুন, ম্যাম বলুন।
আমার পিপিটিটা পেয়েছো তো?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম।
ওকে।
ম্যাম বলছি যদি আপনার সাইড থেকে প্রেজেন্ট করতে চান, প্লিজ শো দ্য please see right side in the lower panel there is one present now option. From there you have an option called present windows.
একটু দেখে নেব?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, definitely.
your entire screen তার মানে আমাকে আগে এটা খুলে নিতে হবে?
না ম্যাম, পাও উইন্ডোটা করে আপনি শুধু এই প্রেজেন্টেশনটা করতে পারেন। আপনি পাওয়ার পয়েন্টটা খুলে নিন। And you are presenting the entire screen, right?
এক মিনিট। Yes, can you see?
Yes, ma'am.
You can see the screen, right?
Yes, ma'am. You can do it a window and only that PowerPoint presentation will then be shown. But this is also fine, ma'am. This is fine. On.
ঠিক আছে।
We are waiting for Indrani, ma'am. Once ma'am join, we will then begin the proceedings.
বিভাস দা, আপনাদের ওখানে অল গুড? কোভিড কন্ডিশন?
Well, better than what it was few weeks ago. Still, there is infection about like 1,000 a day, and death like over 100, 150. But this is significantly less than what it used to be earlier. Yeah, they are opening up now. But
You have
who
started
knows?
your classes? You have started
Oh,
your...
actually, this is our exam time. So, therefore, mostly online activity going on.
Okay.
But what will happen next, we don't know.
আমাদের এখানে তো প্রতিদিনই কেস বাড়ছে।
হ্যাঁ, তো কালকে 18,000 দেখলাম। Yeah, it's tough.
ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গলের মধ্যে আবার পার্টিকুলারলি কলকাতাটা বেশি ট্রাবল দিচ্ছে, কারণ ডেথ রেটটা ইট ইজ নট গোয়িং ডাউন বিলো 9 এখনো।
সেই
Shashi, I think you should call Indrani once.
I'm calling her, but I'm not able to get her over phone.
You're not getting through?
No, ma'am. She's not picking up the call.
could be internet problem.
I can see a few known faces in the participant list. Shubhruto, how are you? কেমন আছো?
হ্যালো ম্যাডাম।
কেমন আছো
হ্যাঁ, সুব্রত বলছি। ভালো আছি ম্যাডাম, আপনি কেমন আছেন?
ভালো আছি। ইন্দ্রাণী is here. ইন্দ্রাণী is here. তোমাদের
Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining. Ma'am,
Yes.
can you hear us?
Yes.
Should we start, ma'am?
Yes.
Sir?
Yeah. Yes.
Good afternoon to one and all present, both here on Google Meet as well as connected via the YouTube live streaming feed. I'm sorry we could not accommodate everybody on this Google Meet due to limitations of the seat and technology constraints, but we all can enjoy the knowledge shared by our speakers. Before we start, I request all those who are connected through Google Meet to kindly ensure that the videos and audios are turned off so that there are no disturbances which occurs. We have connected today from across India and world to witness a discussion on a very important topic, the economic impact of outbreak of novel coronavirus pandemic, also known as the COVID-19, on the Indian economy. To quote Dr. Raghuram Rajan, this is the greatest emergency since independence. And we have reason to worry for. CRISIL announced that this is perhaps the India's worst recession since independence. There has been research by State Bank of India pointing 40% of contraction of GDP by the first quarter of financial year 2021. However, this contraction is not going to be uniform. Rather, will differ according to various sectors and parameters. Though initially the COVID-19 pandemic was a health crisis, now it has gone beyond that. It is affecting the societies and the economies at its core. Although the impact is going to vary from country to country, one thing is for sure, it is likely to increase the poverty and inequality at a global scale, and may not just impact the current generation, but also the future generation, causing an issue of intertemporal sustainabilities. Now, assessing the impact of this COVID-19 crisis on society, economies, and across the vulnerable group is important because this will tailor the responses for the government and the partners who are working towards the recovery of this crisis. There is an urgent socio-economic response required both at global level, national level, as well as local level, in order to reduce the sufferings of those jeopardized who have lost lives and livelihoods. And we are observing this that almost 40% of people probably have lost their jobs, are suffering due to unemployment. India, which has a large portion of population working in informal sectors, are displaced. There are some hidden impacts like those on women empowerment, women employability. There are some impacts which will not be known now, but in future. For that, it becomes important for us, especially those who are directly related or indirectly related with policy making, like our professors, teachers, researchers, and students, to have a discussion on this particular topic, like how coronavirus is going to impact the economy now and in future. The biggest thing we have to discuss on today's webinar is revival versus survival, or is it life versus livelihood, or is it the present versus future? I would like to invite three eminent economists across the globe today with us. We have Dr. Bibhas Shah. Sir is an associate professor in economics at the Durham University Business School. in UK since 2014. Prior to this, Sir taught at University of East Anglia, UK from 2005 to 2014 and at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, which we commonly known as IGIRD. From 1990 to 2005, Sir was also the visiting professor at University of Southern California at the USA. His main research area is microeconomics, game theory, development economics, and has published in numerous papers in reputed economic and academic journals. We also have with us Dr. Indrani Roy Chaudhary, who is currently an associate professor of economics at the Center for the Study of Regional Development, CSRD, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Her area of specializations are health economics, environmental economics, applied game theory, and qualitative economics. And she has earned her publications in various peer-reviewed national and international journals. Prior to her current position at JNU, her past institution affiliation include Department of Economics of Jamia Millia Islamia and National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. She did her PhD in Environmental Economics from the Center of International Trade and Development, CITD, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her MPhil from Jadavpur University. She is currently involved in project on transhuman pastoralism in Himachal Pradesh. She has been also involved with couple of projects related to economic of cancer. Our third speaker is Professor Arijita Datta. She is professor in economics in Calcutta University. She started her professional career at the Biswabharati University before shifting to Calcutta University. An alumnus of Presidency University, Calcutta, and JNU, New Delhi. She completed her PhD from Calcutta University. Her focus area of research is health economics, quantitative development economics. She has various publications in national and international journals to her credit. She has completed numerous research projects. Also, she has been working very closely with Government of West Bengal on various policy matters. She has been visiting researcher at the UNO Merit, Maastricht, Netherlands, and Yamaguchi University, Japan. I thank all the three eminent economists who, from their very busy schedule, agreed to give some time to us so that we can learn. This is welcome, sir, ma'am, with us. And before I start, I'll request all those who have participated to put their question on the chat section to the right of your screen if you are on Google Meet, and on the YouTube comment section. We'll be taking possibly most of the question as per time permit. So I'll request Bivas sir to take over and enlighten us for today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shoshi, Arijita, Indrani, and all other viewers and listeners. I hope you can see the slides now.
Not yet.
So, can you see it? Not yet?
Yes,
okay. Hold on. Let me get this sorted out. Yes, I have to come to this. Right. Now you can see it, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, okay. So without giving too much of introduction to this pandemic that we all know, let me just briefly remind everybody, in case we are not so tuned to the past or the history. Well, it's roughly about 100-year cycle. We are now having pandemics. About 100 years ago, around 1918 to 1919, we had Spanish flu. That took roughly about 500 million people. There are various estimates around the world, but well, I think the figure for India was 15 million people died in India. And another 100 years back, cholera, around 1817, more than 100,000 people died in India. It's also, we can remember the cholera originated from Bengal. And cholera spread to the rest of India by various routes as it is happening now, but more importantly, through a religious festival, Kumbh Mela. So I just thought share this piece of little trivia, keeping in mind that India at the moment is going through a huge surge in infection and still going ahead with all kind of religious festival at the moment. Now, the topic is the economic impact of it, right? Now, the trouble with any prediction in this setting is extremely problematic. As you might be following various forecasts given by IMF or World Bank or any of the central banks around the world have been changing every month. And I'll show you what's the latest forecast we got from World Bank and IMF. Just 2 days ago, this was published. Part of the reason is that most of our audience are economists, so you know that we do projection or prediction mostly relying on a comparative static method. But this is such a massive shock that that methodology is not very helpful. Nonetheless, economists have learned through experience how to model crises, or at least how to predict certain outcomes of the crisis. I should also point out, whenever we hear recovery, we need to think, what do we mean? Is it just GDP? In case of India, it's not just GDP alone. We need to look at poverty reduction as well. Should we add also the health consequence, mortality, for instance? Hello, any problem? Any problem? No, okay. All right. No. All right. So now let's see what's the big organizations are saying. Well, just 2 months ago in April, the IMF forecast was that the world will have a recession by a percentage, about 3%, a 3% recession. Unfortunately, that's now outdated. Now they are predicting 4.9%. In terms of major economies, US is going to have 8%, UK 10.2%, EU also 10.2%, Japan 5%. Now, of course, trade is going to be very, very badly affected, and we are looking at a contraction or a loss of about $4 to $5 trillion globally. Now, $4 to $5 trillion, mind that, that's nearly more than 100%, I would say like 150% to 170% of India's GDP. So this is a massive, massive contraction. 2 months ago, there was still a projection that India and China will still have a positive growth rate. That's now revised. For India is going to have, as far as IMF goes, it's 4.5% loss or recession. China, on the other hand, based on their calculation, will still have a 1% growth. Now, here I should mention that the latest figure I saw on China actually over these few months showing quite a bit of recovery. In fact, China is showing what is been called a V-shaped recovery. China's export and major productions are returning to what is called the pre-COVID level. So that's the situation, but that's only for China. Every country in the world is going to have a recession. Now, this is what we are seeing. In terms of poverty, well, what I'm showing here is slightly old, but still you can see the main figure that we are going to, I'm going to draw your attention to is, skip this slide, is the loss in remittances. Like India and many other countries do rely on a huge amount of remittances from abroad. And I think India receives around $80 billion, something last year or in the last 2 years or so. So that we don't know what's going to happen. Definitely, we're going to see a loss of $40-50 billion, and a bulk of it coming from so-called low-skilled or semi-skilled workers working in Middle East, East Asia, and so on and so forth. Capital also has been leaving the developing countries. What about poverty? Well, World Bank has made some forecast now on that. So we are going to see global poverty will rise by from 7.9% to 8.82%. So it's the first time since I think 1990 or so that the global poverty is going to go up, and we are looking at here extreme poverty, and overall there is going to be 688 to 700 million extremely poor people in the world. Out of that, 71 million will be added this year, which is very, very problematic. India will have 12 to 15 million new poor. Well, what about inequality? Well, it is probably expected that the way low-income workers in India has suffered over this lockdown period, and of course the long-term health impact and everything, this is going to be a big problem. On the other hand, I mean, the low-income people have absolutely no kind of insurance or safety, whereas the others, people who are well off and so on, they are going to be sort of protected, and that means we are going to have an increase in the Gini coefficient. Now, World Bank is saying if we have 1% increase in Gini, that would force 19 million people into extreme poverty. And we won't be surprised if the Gini for India and many other poor countries go up by more than 1 percentage point. So that's the kind of it's very, very worrisome picture. Unemployment, I do not need to say more on these. It's some of the conservative estimates we are getting is about 23% to 30% of India's workforce is unemployed. In the informal sector, it's believed that about ILO estimates that about 80% of the people worldwide will lose their jobs for a significant period of time. Now, stimulus. India has announced, like most other countries, a package of roughly 270 billion or 10% of its GDP. People have questions, is it really 10%? Is it 7, 8%, 6%, etc.? Or is it different projects, just renamed, rebranded, etc.? So keep aside that debate. In fact, you can see India is among one of the more the kind of higher on the list in terms of aggressive intervention. Japan is probably the highest with 20% of its GDP, US 13, and UK, EU, China, you can see the figures up there is 5% around that or less. Now, what can we expect from 2021? Well, the experts are saying, and they are saying with a lot of caveat, our recovery projections for India about 6% positive growth. The world economy itself will bounce back 5.4. China, as usual, will have higher growth rate of 8%, 8.2%, and US, UK, all the major regions. Now, I was listening to a webinar yesterday from World Bank experts who have written this project report, but they are throwing in now a lot of words of caution around it. I mean, this is they assume that there is going to be one likely second wave, but assumptions are made about how long that wave can stay and the mortality figure and so on and so forth. But there are two things that they are warning about. One is that we assume that the financial sector will still remain okay. And that's a big question. We know in the past, 2008-9, there was crisis starting from financial sector, but then it affected the real sector of the economy. Now, in this case, it can go from other way. It can lead to a financial sector crisis, and if that happens, we are looking at a very, very prolonged recession. So is it going to be V-shaped? Is it going to be even W-shaped? Is it going to be U-shaped or L-shaped? Nobody knows, but all of these is definitely a big concern. What to do? Well, Maitreyi Ghatak and his co-authors have written elsewhere to create a global solidarity fund. And that is a good idea. Question is, do we have sort of the global will to do it? Do we have global leadership? We probably the world. This is a time for coming together and cooperate on each of, not just health, but also on the economic front. But that is not happening. Whether it is a race for vaccine, whether it is trade war, China, US trade war is going to continue. All of these are going to make it very, very difficult to manage a crisis like this. And on top of that, India's internal conditions were not very helpful to tackle this crisis. As you know, earlier policies of demonetization and GST made a huge impact in a negative way on the economy. So India entered this pandemic with a lot of problems in hand, and it's not going to be get better anytime soon. I'm afraid. But there is, I'm not so skeptical about informal sectors and others. I think there is some degree of resilience in that, but I would not go into this. There are other speakers who can shed more lights on those issues. And if there is a question at the end, I can come back. Thank you. Yes.
Joshi?
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'll request Indrani ma'am to unmute herself, please, and then take over.
Yeah. Thank you, Shoshi. Thank you, Professor Shaha, Professor Dept, and others who are participating in this webinars. So Professor Shaha has made a very detailed macro picture, so which is happening due to this health shock globally vis-a-vis India. So my task is in that case much easier. So I would rather focus on a very very narrow sense to the health issues, and to a certain extent the issues of the lockdown. So globally, we all know that since December 2019, we are going through a severe health shocks, and this shock is having multiple impact, but the developing countries are the worst sufferers. So far as the economic shocks are concerned, so the health shock is actually transmitted into the economic shocks, and which has multiple dimensions, which I'll like to discuss a little bit. So mostly the nation governments have taken two different strategies. One is the suppression strategy, which is basically the lockdown, which deals with the confinement of the whole populations, obviously with certain exceptions like the health workers and the essential supply lines. workers. And the second one is the mitigation strategy. That means those who are actually infected, they have to remain in the quarantine for 2 weeks. Now, obviously, this nationwide enforcement which India has adopted is something which very draconian, and which has taken place in 5 phases, with some sequential flexibilities have been exercised, but this has a huge trade-off. So the trade-off is in the sense of the cost and the benefit. So what we incurred in terms of this lockdown, the cost which we incurred in terms of the lockdown is having a huge impact on the poverty, huge impact on the loss of livelihoods, huge impact on the health, and obviously the benefit is in terms of the suppression of the disease progression, and loss of life has been to a certain extent checked. But it is in the absence of the various evidence which are required in order to actually conclude that how much we gained due to lockdown is something under questions, because very little informations are available in the public domain. So which of the instruments of the lockdown, that means whether locking down the schools and the colleges and the universities have made some very strong impact on the health aspect, or whether locking down all these factories and workshops and shops and various businesses has actually made some very positive impact. So that kind of things are yet to be analyzed, and we don't know actually that the various instruments, which of these instruments are actually powerful in containing the disease. Now, I would like to, so that this is a twin crisis which India is witnessing. The health crisis has been transmitted into the economic crisis, but these downturns are actually, there is the direction of these causality, that means the health and the economic shocks are something which is simultaneous in a dynamic framework. And obviously the feedback mechanism from either side would actually trigger the other crisis further. So I don't want to go to the details of all the forecasts which has been made about India. Professor Saha has given a very detailed descriptions. So the IMF, we all know that India is going to contract about 4.5% of the GDP, which was very recent IMF forecasting. But the deeper concern is on the distributional aspects of the contraction, because with 85% or 90% of the Indian workforce who are engaged in the informal sector, so who is actually bearing the greater cost of these contractions and the catastrophic impact in terms of the job and the livelihood loss is something which is a matter of a great concern. So the experts, according to the various suggestions, the robust policy suggestions are basically, we have to strengthen our healthcare infrastructure, we have to reinforce our social security nets, but unfortunately in both these fronts, we don't see much hopeful picture. So whether this lockdown is actually needed, I would like to dwell on this for a few minutes. So it is since it's a matter of the loss of human life, so it's a very serious issue. So it is, and also very sensitive. So that basically rationalize the lockdown, at least in the initial periods, and this is basically the prescriptions from a team of epidemiologists, public health specialists, virologists, immunologists, everybody. But the rationale has been challenged by also many, like the Paul Romer and Alan Gerbers. They actually talked about the two complementary strategies. That means they basically says that if you ramp up the testing and allow certain flexibilities of those who are tested negative in the standard RT-PCR test or in the serological test, they should be given the option to work, and and also like so that these twin strategies of increasing the testing and then allowing some people to work in a selective manner. So that is the prescriptions, and that has been actually supported by many. Dept report also suggested that the healthy workers needs to be identified and they should be brought back to the workforce in Europe. And this also has been, the similar concern has been also raised by the Devraj Roy and Subramanian. So they also talk about the flexibility in terms of self-selective manner. So the 20 to 40 years, the younger populations who are less vulnerable in terms of the severity, disease severity as well as mortality, they should be actually allowed to work, and that is also on selective manner. And the older population should be protected through various means. And there are also the concerns that many of the experts have actually raised concerns on the mortality rate. And so like David Katz is one of them who is very vocal in the social media. So he is actually asking that the mortality which is being presented is overestimated due to selection bias. And this is basically due to the problem of detection problems, which arises because many of the populations who are infected remains asymptomatic, and therefore they don't bother to go and report in the hospital, and that basically shrinks the denominator of the infected people. Jay Bhattacharya and his colleagues in the Stanfords, they also concluded that the infection rate is much higher than whatever is being recorded about the confirmed cases. So they are in their study of the Santa Clara County, where they have shown this, that the infection may be much widespread, which was 2.8% rather than what has been available in the official documents. So I would rather, now let me just go to the behavioral aspect, because this is very important so far as the policies are concerned, but unfortunately, our policymakers are not very much active in that respect. So no, in terms of the prescriptions which are available, that is not reflecting this side. So I'd like to share the slide, 1 minute. Yes, so this is the slide which basically talks about the prevalence response behavior. And if you just see that the pure epidemiological, sorry, 1 minute. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay. So this is basically the graph which is showing that if we take the prevalence in the horizontal axis and infection hazard ratio in the vertical axis, we see that in the pure epidemiological model, it is a monotonically increasing function where the behavioral aspects are not basically endogenized. So it is, but if we take the economic model, which may try to integrate the epidemiological model in economics, we find that it is the inverted U-shaped, where it is seen that even though the prevalence is widespread, there is a contraction in the infectivity. That means the infection hazard ratio shows some kind of a contractions, basically because the prevalence elasticity of demand for self-protections is positive. So the people becomes aware of the risk of the morbidity as well as the mortality, and they do take various kinds of averting behavior. They becomes much more risk averse, and therefore, even though we notice that the prevalence is rising, but the epidemics can be self-limiting because of the people's action. So this is one famous study by the Geofford and Phillipson's 1996, which they have observed for the HIV patients in San Francisco during the period of 1983 to 92. And if you see the graph, just one minute, let me change. Yes, if you see the graph, what you find is that it is increasing. The prevalence is increasing, but at the same time that the hazard ratio is falling. So especially during the later part of this study, the periods during the 90s, it is actually showing a falling trend. So that actually shows that the people, those especially in this case of the gay populations, are actually becoming more alert in terms of taking various averting behaviors, in using the various protections, condoms, and other things, and the behavior is much more strikingly alert for not only for the gay population who are living in the cities, the gay populations who are bachelors, so who are single. So that basically shows, establishes that the positive elasticity of the prevalence elasticity of demand. And why I'm raising this point is actually because this has certain policy implication. So in the sense that, before going to that, I would also like to say that it is not that this kind of positive prevalence elasticity of demand has been shown in many of the other studies on measles, studies on influenza. So there are these also, they also confirmed that this positive elasticity of demand is prevalent. Okay, so why I would like to say this, raise this point is that people actually alter their demand for self-protections based on this disease prevalence, severity, that carries certain implications for the policy. So in the country with a poor education base, and that means the country which has a very, very poor information processing capacity, this is something which is to be taken in a very serious manner, because the state has a larger role to play in order to influence the preference, in order to influence by giving them right kind of informations, by targeting the populations, by sharing informations through some very widespread campaign. And because if the people's behavior changes, that actually has a serious important implications in terms of containing the disease. Now, if you look at the Indian scenarios, various states, and this has been available in the medias, that many of the states, they are not observing the lockdowns properly, even though it is basically pushed in a centralized manner. That means many of the states, and especially among the poorer pockets where the awareness is very, very poor, they actually are not very much serious about the consequences of contracting the infections. And that also has certain rationale, in a sense that given the typical nature of the disease, where you have a major populations who are being infected remains asymptomatic or with a very mild infections, they don't need to report, and that basically leads to a certain kind of a casualness among the people. And not only that, given that our dependency ratios are pretty much unfavorable, so we have a less than 10% dependency ratio so far as the elderlies are concerned. So in that sense, that given that we have a very large chunk of young populations, working populations, who are very less susceptible in terms of severity, they would not take these things in a very serious manner. So there, the state has an important role to play in order to influence their behavior by doing the appropriate information sharing. Another thing I would also like to highlight is that apart from the suppression strategy, the mitigation strategy, which is individual centric. So that means there is the people who would be infected, would be tested positive, they should be put under the quarantine for at least 14 days. So this thing is actually attached with a lot of information disclosure problems, because the younger, given that they are more susceptible, and than the elderlies, and in terms of they have a huge opportunity cost in terms of their lost wages, lost employment. So they don't want to just reveal their information about their infections and like to remain hidden. So these detection problems is a major problem so far as the policies are concerned, and especially after these migration problems, because now we have the migrant laborers who are from the cities have actually transmitted into the rural scenarios, and there is a caution from various quarters that many of the peri-urbans, many of the rural pockets would be the next hotspots. So in that context, the information disclosure is something which has to be taken in a very serious note, and therefore certain incentives has to be created in order to just make the people, incentivize the people to disclose their informations. So some kind of a quarantine allowances and other benefits may be helpful. And I'm not aware which the Singapore has taken by giving, I think that $1,000 per day quarantine allowance. And I'm not aware of any of the Indian states who have actually done it except Orissa. So Orissa, I'm aware that have actually introduced 15,000 incentive per for the 2 weeks of quarantine if somebody is infected. But that actually gives some kind of incentives to the people who are infected to submit their informations or to share their informations by going to the test centers and going for the test, and that actually would lead to the suppression or the containment of the disease to a larger extent. Okay, so the next thing which I would also like to share is the problem of the testing. So the problem of the testing, it is globally a problem, and the underreporting is something which is widely prevalent, and it is not only the developing countries' problem, but also the developed countries' problem, because of the typical nature of the disease, where you have a major section of the populations who are actually asymptomatic. Now, apart from that, if we look at the Indian states and from the aggregated data from India, it is very, very paradoxical. It is very easy to conclude anything because of the selections and where there's a huge misinterpretation of the data. Sampling designs are not standardized. There is also lack of political incentives to dampen the numbers of the COVID positive cases. So those things, especially I would like to highlight the two states, Bihar and West Bengal, who are actually who would be having elections, assembly elections in the very recently. Bihar in this year and West Bengal next year have very less incentive to reveal the information of higher positivity. So I would like to show some data which would actually help to understand the problem. So this is the Indian picture, which obviously gives you a very, very gloomy picture that the countries which are leading in terms of the disease are actually doing much more higher, showing much more seriousness in terms of testing. So, but India still the picture, we have a positivity rate of 6.3%, but we have tested a figure per million is only 5,590, and which we are way behind many of the countries. Apart from that, let me just go to the next slide. And this is for the state pictures, where you can see the Indian. So you see that Delhi is the example where you have the high positivity rate along with the testing, which is also very test per million population is also very high. So that basically talks about the gravity of the problems, and which is basically expected. But in many of the states, you will find just the reverse scenario, that you have a high positivity rate, but the testing, in terms of the testing, the progress is not much. And this clearly shows that there is a certain tendency to suppress the data, and there is a lot of complaint from the public that there is a delay in getting the reports. So where once they have reported and we have gone for the testing results are actually being deliberately withheld, and this is not a particular state. Many states are actually reporting this problem. So these are all actually a deliberate attempt to dampen the positivity rate, and you can see that many of the states who are actually in the higher side, above the national average in terms of the positivity in percentage of the people who are tested, who actually tested positive. But in terms of the test, they are doing very, very poorly. And the Bihar is one state which you can see that it is glaringly, the figure is very low. So from these testing scenarios, we should actually try to collect the disease burden along with the testing scenarios. Otherwise, the comparative pictures are not something which is giving a clear understanding of the disease progressions. I would like to highlight another thing, which is basically which has been raised by Professor regarding the impoverishment, the increase in the impoverishment, and he has already said that 12 to 15 million new poor people will be added in the Indian scenario. And that actually, I would like to show this slide, which will help us. This is actually our own calculation from the NSS 71st round, and as well as the ISDS data, where we have shown that for the quintile-wise catastrophic health expenditure for a different level percentage of the non-food expenditures. And if you see that for the quintal, first 2-3 quintals were actually very poor in terms of their in terms of their marginal monthly per capita consumption expenditure, it is showing a very depressing scenario. So along with the COVID, along with the livelihood loss and the job loss and severe unemployment problem, this catastrophic health expenditure is going to be a really something which is a matter of severe policy consequences. And I would also like to highlight that India is a country with a very 1% of the GDP being allocated for the health in public health, and 70% of the expenditure, aggregate health expenditure, is actually incurred from the outer pocket. And the people's treatment, if you look at the treatment accessibilities, 75% are actually catered through the private sources. So given this background, one can understand that the severity of the problem in this respect. Next, I would like to go through yes. So what is again a matter of concerns given these economic shocks and economic downturns is that the delayed we have a huge burden of disease treatment on various fronts. Like the first is a child immunization program is very much affected because of this the COVID-19 health shocks. We have 130 million kids below the age of 5 years, and the UNICEF has reported that the under 5 child mortality in 2018, India is in the top, and with 8.8 lakh. It is below Nigeria, it is below Pakistan, and below many other countries. So this is something which we should be, because many of the, if we look at the child mortality and the infant mortality, many of the mortalities can be checked because they are all vaccine preventables. But if we look at the immunizations, still we are struggling with the 100% immunizations. Our immunization progress is, I guess, it is stuck at 67% for the child immunizations, according to the NFHS last NFHS report. So this entire immunization program is highly affected, and that has a severe consequence on the child mortality. Not only that, we have the TB programs, which India has made some progress. The polio vaccination program, then we have this cancer detection therapies. So we have a whole bunch of the different morbidities, the burdens, which are under great stress due to this COVID-19. So next, lastly, I would just like to highlight that what lessons we can draw from these twin shocks, that means the health shocks transmitted into the economic shocks. So are many. So we have to revamp our health infrastructure. We have to strengthen our manpower in the health sector. So apart from that, there is one important threat which is also upcoming, is the antibiotic, the issue of the antibiotic resistance, which is a huge negative externality problem. So this antibiotic resistance has been started, and it is going to be a severe threat, especially for the developing country, and especially for the country like in India, because that will actually threaten our ability to treat common infectious diseases. So like the tuberculosis, pneumonia, blood poisonings, etc. So the antibiotics, so this is why it is happening, is actually because our regulatory mechanisms are very weak, and out of the counter prescriptions, and then the doctors' incentive problems. That means the physicians have the incentive to cure the patient, and therefore very widespread prescriptions of the antibiotics are happening, especially in the less developed countries. And we have the advantage in the supply side. We have very cheap medicine drugs which are available because of our own inbuilt resources of the generic drugs production. That actually is something which we should learn and be cautious about our future, because these kinds of shocks, we are not, as the developed countries has actually failed to deal with, many of the developed countries has actually failed to deal with this pandemics, and the developing countries are struggling severely. And in these scenarios, we should actually try to learn how to cope with the various other potential threats, which are also sometimes happening in the near future. So I thank all of you. I don't know whether some value addition has been made. So okay, so just 1 minute. I would like to share 2 slides before I just wrap it up. So this is the slide which shows that the distribution of death by the major diseases, and that shows that 38.2%, this is census data, so little old, but we can think of that still India is struggling with the communicable diseases. So over 30% of the disease are from the communicable disease, and major part of that diseases are infectious disease. So the importance of the antibiotic resistance is something which should be taken on that account. And this is the last slide which I would like to share, that this is how the mortality and the morbidity pattern of the communicable diseases, and you can see that the acute respiratory disease, pneumonias, and the disease like the Henne's, so all these needs a huge dose of antibiotics. So you can understand that the failure of the antibiotic to actually becomes effective is a huge threat in the malnourished for the health scenarios in India. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was an excellent presentation guiding us through the health structure of Indian economy. I'd like to invite Professor Arijita Datta to enlighten us with her views.
Thank you, Shashi. Just a minute. Indrani, can you...
Ma'am, I'll just take 1 second. Indrani, ma'am, can you please close your presentation?
Yes.
And all those who are live on Google Meet, can you please switch off your videos? Kindly switch off your videos, those who are on YouTube live other than the presenters.
Yeah. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Thank you, Shashi, for inviting me in this discussion. I also thank Bibhajda and Indrani to be a part of this very crucial but very exciting discussion. As Bibhajda in the initial overarching framework made this points with the macroeconomic situation, Indrani has talked about the health scenario, and now I will be talking about a little bit on labor force participation in India, and I will be specifically talking on the female labor force participation. Now, in the background, I would like to say that we all know that there's an unusually low rate of Indian labor force participation by the women, and that is in spite of the substantial rise in female literacy, robust economic growth, and a fertility transition. So in spite of all these three, we have seen a continuous decline in the female labor force participation rate, and that is including the primary and subsidiary status. I will be talking more about this primary and subsidiary status later on. And what we find that the women aged 25 to 54 have stagnated, their female labor force participation has stagnated for the urban areas to 26 to 28%, whereas between 1987 and 2011, there has been a substantial drop in the rural areas, so from 57% to 44%. Now, under the similar enabling factors, however, we have found that the female labor force participation rose substantially in Latin American countries, in Middle East countries, and also in North African countries. Now, this is the overall picture that if we look at the graph, the two graphs on the top are them for men, blue for the rural male, and the orange one is for the urban male. Now, the lower two graphs are about for the female. One is the rural female and another is the urban female. So if you look at across the various rounds of NSS, what you find that there has been a kind of a push, a rise from 2004 to 2011, and then a substantial drop again. Only where the drop was relatively less was in urban female. But particularly in the rural female scenario, you find a substantial drop. Now, given this, there has been a lot of literature which has come up on explaining of this limited labor force participation by women. And one of the most important of them is feminization U hypothesis, which actually talks about the mechanism for the initial decline of the labor force participation, comprising of rising incompatibility of work and family duties as the workforce moves away, and an income effect of husband earnings. So as the development process gets spread, what happens that within the household's men's income, when that increases, and as always females wage rate or earnings are considered as the subsidiary income which supplements the household income. So when the income effect of the husband's earnings as an income effect, there is a drop in the female labor force participation. And not to forget the stigma against the female working outside, and generally in particular some sectors, and particularly among the Hindu upper caste women. So the rising section, then this is the what I just discussed was the declining part, and the rising section emerges with a receding stigma, high potential earnings of females as their education improves, as well as the fertility decline further. Now, ethnicity and female labor force participation is a very strong connection, because any labor force participation in India has been historically and mythologically connected to ethnicity, because that is what our Varnashram talks about. Now, working outside the household has been more socially acceptable among the women of lower castes, while women from the higher castes tend to face greater restrictions. And in particular, women from the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes have the highest participation rates. Now, underestimation of female works has been one of the other hypotheses to explain this fall in the labor force participation, and there has been a number of papers on this. I would like to mention about Deshpande and Kabir's paper in 2019, where it documents the fuzziness between the boundary of domestic work and unpaid work. So basically, when we talk about that women are not going out, that means that women are actually involved in many of the domestic work, and it is definitely unpaid. But what happens that they are actually going for expenditure saving activities. So when they are at home, they are taking care of many, they are using their care the caregiver role for the children, for the elderly, and sometimes to the entire household. So this is not just unpaid, but this is expenditure saving activities. Now, Deshpande and Kabir's paper also very succinctly points out that religion and visible markers such as veiling are not significant determinant of probability of working. This is very important observation in 2019, particularly in West Bengal, because so far the existing literature was pointing out that the Muslim women were participating less in the in the labor force. But as we find that religion and visible markers like the burqas and the hijabs, they are not significantly determinants of the probability of working. Now I come to the pandemic and the economic crisis, as my stage is already set by two eminent speakers. It is an easier duty for me to talk about pandemic. And we know that the coronavirus pandemic will almost certainly affecting the female employment situation in most of the developing countries. And it will exacerbate existing inequalities in society. So as I said, there was already very, very strong inequalities in the society. While all vulnerable populations will suffer, if we look into this entire problem through a gender lens, it will be particular for the lowest in of caste, class, or religious stratification. So what I mean to say that women and lower caste, women and poorest economic class, women and religious minority classes, they are going to be worst hit because of this pandemic. Here are my versions of why. Now, as I had said, that care economy is mostly dependent on the women. Women already bear a disproportionate burden of care economy. even when they're participating in the labor market. So there is a big OECD study which points out that it's not just taking care of children and elderly and other household duties, but many a times they're also participating in the labor market. So this burden just got heavier with the closure of schools and daycare centers. So what is happening that the children are staying back in the houses for the entire day, and all those daycare centers are also closed, including the midday meals are limited, though in certain states the steps have been taken to supply the midday meals, but those midday meals are only for the dry ration of midday meal. So the onus lies on the women to cook with those dry ration as well. So the work burden that has definitely increased for the care economy. Now, coming to the specific sectors, now when we talk about social distancing guidelines, is right after the longer, this is going to be in our economy even after the lockdown. So even if the lockdown is revoked, now we are listening to these ideas that we will have to learn to live with COVID. So therefore, the jobs in the sectors that require close human interactions, like construction, retail, and most of the informal sector, these sectors are the most difficult sectors that are going to be. And also not to forget the traditional formal care sector, that is the nursing sector. So all these are actually require more human interaction, and the other side of the sectors are more technologically and formal sectors where distancing is feasible. See, in IT sector, we know that a large proportion of the IT sector, if not an overwhelming share of these sectors, they are actually resorting to working from home because the distancing is feasible. But when you talk about construction, retail, or most of the other informal sector, it is not possible. And if you look at the women participation, their participation is overwhelmingly higher in the former group. That is where it requires human interaction. Now, distress-induced employment is hardly likely to improve the situation. Right? So on one hand, the women, the areas where women are working are going to be more difficult in terms of keeping the social distancing. And if the social distancing is not maintained, that means the women will be exposed to more higher risk of pandemic. On the other hand, if the women are forced due to distress because their husbands, their partners are laid off, they are not in the labor force anymore, this is hardly going to improve the situation because the women will be forced to accept the lower wages and they will work for longer hours, layoffs, and also what will happen that their overall condition for their work, that is what we call the decent employments, that is going to go down. Now, what about the formal sector? Those like us who are in the formal sector, women employees in the formal sector may also be viewed as more costly post the Maternity Act situation, which entitles the women to 6 months paid leave. Saying this, my intention is not to say that the Maternity Act is wrong, it is incorrect, or it is not acceptable. What I'm saying that it is flawed at its implementation level because there is no support for paid leave. As Indrani was pointing out, that for those who are staying back at home for the quarantine, if there is no government support for that, there will be a tendency to break that quarantine and come out for the income. So same here, since the private, if you look at the private sector, if the women are allowed to have a 6 months paid leave, that means that the employer will be very, very skeptic to hire the newly hired the women at this point of juncture. And work from home, as I said, it has been turned out to be a curse in disguise. I have a lot of friends who work, and neighbors, of course, who are working work from home, doing work from home, and they are taking care of, during this lockdown period, they had a tremendous problem. So they had to cook, they had to clean, they had to take care of their children, and that also work from home. And when there is a work from home, the duration always extends. It's not, it goes beyond the office hours. So the formal sector problems are at their own position. Now, coming to the evidence-based proof. So far, I have found one paper by Ashwini Deshpande, which uses the national level panel data from CMIE on the Consumers Pyramids Household Survey database for a discussion paper on the Ashoka University's website. So that there was, it is clear that there is a fall in employment among men was 29% between March 2019 and 2020, while that among women was 39.5%. So almost more than 10 percentile more fall was observed in case of women. And when she went into further disaggregation, she found that the loss was mostly focused among the Dalit women. So it was the scheduled caste women who suffered the most and whose labor force participation declined the most. Now, as I said, that distress-led labor force participation will not sustain. Even if it does, there seems to be a shift in the nature of the participation. Now, you remember the first graph that I showed. I'll just go back quickly to this one. There was a slight increase between 2004-5 and 2011-12. This was the period which was marked actually with a very strong agrarian crisis. Right. So when this is happening, so there is a shift in the nature. So more women seem to do a lot of variety of works. So it's not just one type work, like I'm just an agricultural laborer, or I'm just a construction worker. No. What happens, because they're forced, they work in different types of work. So there are agricultural laborers during the harvest season. They are doing some construction jobs, and they are collecting dangerous primary products. Like, for example, if in Sundarban areas and also in Purulia areas, they go to the forests when it is always not very safe, but they go and they do collect the primary forest products. Now, what does that mean in terms of economic data sets? See, I was a part of a study funded by World Bank, where we were discussing about the issue among the scheduled tribe women in Purulia. So at that time, when I was looking at the census figures of the West Bengal tribal dominated blocks, there was clear indication that between 2001 and 2011, there was a shift in the main workers category. And very surprisingly, unlike the rest of the country, there was an increase in the participation. So, and how do I define main workers category? It's for them who had worked for more than at least 183 days in the last 365 days. That is 1 year. So when I had a look at this, so I was a bit surprised that does that mean that this informalization and marginalization of labor force is not happening in these areas and they are becoming more empowered? So this study was also had also this opportunity to have qualitative data and narratives that we had collected after the COVID situation. We collected it through teleconferencing and video conferencing. But the story that was emerging, that it is true that they are working for more than 183 days. In fact, to quote them, একদিন কাজ না করলে খাবো কি? So it was not that they were doing it very voluntarily, but they are doing almost every day under strong compulsion. And that is what, in terms of NSSO terminology, this is subsidiary engagement. So when we are looking at usual employment status, usual status, which considers both primary and subsidiary. But when there is an overall shift, what we find that between 2011-12 and 2017-18, among the women, rural women, all India, there was a drop in the subsidiary engagement. But my experience with the primary data, and also with this my fear with this COVID is that engagement in work in subsidiary capacity may arise out of the following two situations. Number one, the person may be engaged for a relatively longer period during the last 365 days in some economic or non-economic activity, and for a relatively shorter period in another economic activity. Number two, a person may be pursuing an economic activity almost throughout the year in the principal usual activity status, and also simultaneously pursuing another economic activity. So what is the difference between 1 and 2? In 2, there is their principal usual activity status is almost throughout the day, throughout the year, which actually marks like the main worker category. But whereas in the first case, it is they are engaged relatively longer period, but maybe not more than 183 days, and which is complemented by shorter period in other economic activities, which is subsidiary. So they are main workers, but due to subsidiary activities. So it's not that they are main workers because of their principal activities. And since I was taking these narratives and the qualitative data in the post-COVID period, that's in May and June, early June. So what I was finding that they are working almost day in and day out. Normally, they go out during this period, they go to the districts like Bardhaman and Purba Medinipur for harvest. Since they could not go due to lockdown, so now they are working in the local construction activities. They are using their homestead land for some cultivation, and also they are doing other petty jobs. They are going to forests, collecting leaves, and they're doing all sorts of petty jobs. So what is happening that they are actually moving from principal activity to a subsidiary activity. So an ethnic dimension may be also crucial, which does not represent the overall economic improvement, but it also needs further nuances. So when I talk about overall the economic, the female labor force participation in the post-COVID era, I am more skeptic. I find that on one hand, the formal sector jobs are drying, and when it is going on, the more laid off will be among the women. In the informal sector, the jobs that are available for the women, they are more dangerous in the post-COVID scenario because the distancing is becoming difficult. Social distancing is becoming difficult. And thirdly, this angle of subsidiary activities in NSSO. And Unfortunately, I did not locate further detailed study on this primary and subsidiary activities literature. But this has to be, I'm working on this on the NSSO latest round to find that what is the proportion across the different categories of social caste and religious caste and economic classes, how far the subsidiary activities are increasing. And mind you, this involvement in the subsidiary activities more and more actually hints towards far more vulnerability and far more criticality for these women. So that is what I wanted to share. And so that's it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I want to thank all the three economists present with us to provide such interesting deliberation of the present situation. It went very well, starting from Vibhas Shah, who presented the international situation of India. Then we came to national scenario with Indrani ma'am talking about Indian states and its positions and its health structure. And finally, Arjita ma'am talking at grassroots level, at state level, and the problem that is faced by women and the weaker section of the society. We have a few questions over here. I would like to put them to the speakers. And this probably is for Indrani ma'am. It says that healthy worker from a massive workforce, to identify them, it is a cumbersome process and time-consuming process. How should we go ahead with this?
Yeah, that's what we are stuck, because the prescription is that along with this RC PCR test, the standard test, India should also aggressively ramp up the serology or the antibody test. So that actually, if the tests are done in a very widespread manner, that will actually establish that the kind of antibody, whether the person is already infected and then cured, and that person who are actually tested positive in the antibody test may join work. So that is basically the prescriptions from various experts. So that actually antibody test we have actually made a very delayed introduction of antibody test. Now I guess it has already started. Delhi is actually planning to do it in a very widespread manner. In other parts of the state, it is actually catching up, but we are actually missing the vital time when it was actually needed. Before, we thought of just extending the lockdown or withdrawing the lockdown. So those decisions were taken much more arbitrarily, rather backed by certain scientific findings.
And there's another question is how the government can raise revenue while most of the economic activities are hampered, but the expenditures are increasing for the government. This is one particular question that is striking my head, that over the point of time, the coffer of the government is getting weak and weak, and the expenditure rising. How would the government tackle, given the fact that we already have a very low share of GDP going to health sector? So your take, ma'am.
It's me, Shashi.
Ma'am, it is for Indrani, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that Professor Shah would be better to just deal with this question. But I would like to say that this is not the time to actually the government are looking for various revenue generation, because all the economic activities are actually getting stagnant or facing a huge contraction. So the revenue side generation from the government side is also not in a very good shape, but the initial phase should be mostly done by the deficit financing. The government should try to just make money through printing notes, So, and after that, once the economy comes to certain pace, then the other avenues should be explored. But this is, I'm not the right person.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now that tricky question is thrown at me. I'm not a macroeconomist, okay. But okay, let's see what can we say about it. Well, government can borrow from international markets, domestic markets, and of course they can monetize through the Reserve Bank. Now, this is a situation where you cannot have those kind of fiscal discipline and all those things. So one difficulty for India as compared to a hard currency country like US, EU and UK, etc., is that those currencies have certain degree of reliability and credibility. So they can borrow at a much lower rate than India can. So India's 10% of GDP, as people have contested that number, some people think it is 6-7%, but it is definitely probably in excess of 5%. And this is where Indian government, I'm sure, worried that if your deficit goes up well above 5%, you will be in trouble in terms of your credit rating. India cannot have the benefit of hard currency countries. And this is where going into 10% territory has other long-term consequences, and obviously inflation will be a concern sooner or later. And that's why I showed those figures that EU, UK, and China are still in the so-called fiscal prudence territory as much as possible as of now. Things may change after a few months. So for India, that's a very tough one, but they will probably monetize quite a lot. Inflation will be an issue. To what extent, I can't put a figure on that. I don't have that expertise, but it's a big problem. It's going to come.
Thank you, sir. So there's another question. Mr. Ganguly has asked that these job losses may not be limited to just marginal or low-level workers, but may also impact the white-collar participants. So how is India prepared for such losses?
Yeah, is it for me or?
Yes, it's for you.
Okay, right. So yes, white collar is going to happen. You see, just few days ago, I do not know how much it has become a news in India. Trump has sort of stopped H-1B visa, which would hugely affect India. So IT jobs have been a problem last few years. And then, I mean, we talk about US-China trade war, but US has not forgotten India also. Another piece of news a few days ago came that the US Department of Transportation is going to slap Air India with a court case that India has repatriated illegally or breaching US rules the stranded passengers from the US. So that's they are going to slap a fine, and it's going to be a problem. So white collar jobs in many sectors will be affected, particularly, and I was saying there is an issue of financial sector. It's still not been badly affected yet, but down the line, NPA is going to go up hugely. And then you have mortgage problems. So all these things, when then pile up, jobs in the financial sector will also go. There may be, on the other hand, some job growth in the pharmaceutical sectors and biotechnology and so on. That's but that's certainly not a big one compared to this. But as I said, we should not forget that we came to this situation. We were having 8% plus growth rate up to 2016. Then came out of the blue demonetization, and it's probably a political decision. Economically, it doesn't make much sense. And then within a year, I think 2017, middle of that, you had GST. What GST has done after that is that the state finances have become in terrible situation now. And states are responsible for managing the health at the ground level, but states don't have money. So two blows back to back have kind of crippled the economy. We came down to 4-5%, and now we'll go down to minus 4-5%. So that's about an 8-9% fall. And in this context, I should add one more figure, that India's case mortality ratio or case fatality ratio, I think CFR, people died as percentage of positive COVID cases is about 3%, I think, little over 3. We have 15,000 deaths as of this morning, I saw, and nearly 490,000 cases of that. So we are looking at roughly about 3%. But look at the global figure. The global figure is about, I think we now have 5 million infected, 5 million cases, and the death toll is 500,000, just about 10%. And this 10% is something interesting. I started with the Spanish flu story 100 years ago. Spanish flu had a world over death of 50 million, and the infection was about 500 million. So that was also 10%. Spanish flu continued for 1.5 years to 2 years. In fact, actually more than that. It's more than 2 years, but it was recorded over 1.5 years. There was no vaccine ever discovered for Spanish flu. We have some flu jabs, but that's another story. But now, so I have a feeling that India's mortality rate we are seeing is going to go up. This 3% does not seem to be, it's too much on the lower side. I'm not saying there is an under testing this and that, but there could be. But if there is under testing, under reporting, it should happen everywhere. I mean, both testing and death count, etc. But the thing is, I think Indrani pointed out earlier that our elderly population is a much smaller percentage. The demography is favorable. It is also the case, younger people in India are getting infected first, and they will then infect the elderly. So what we are going to see today, this morning's figure is 18,000, I think last 24 hours. It's going to go up, and elderly will be infected. And I'm afraid this 3% will go up to, I do not know, hopefully not 10%, but probably 6-7%. I am afraid might go up. So where were you? You asked me about the job figure. I strayed into this. So the thing is, we are at the stage of upsurge. I know a month ago some eminent experts, and I do not want to name them, we respect and their work, but they were under the assumption, they were saying that we think India is nearly done. The infection was in the range of 10,000 or little over 1,000, 2,000 or so. And it stayed that way, and everybody was thinking maybe we are over the hill now. But
Arjita ma'am, this asked Ms. Sanchita Haldar has been asking you that since there are impact on women workers in informal sector, how is this going to impact the current situation and the future generation, women empowerment, livelihood of other women?
That's what I tried to point out, Shashi, that since it's going to affect not only women in the informal sector, but also in the formal sector. So there will be definitely the ability to earn income, and of course the women empowerment issues, though the literature does suggest that women empowerment is not directly one-to-one related to the women's income earning capacity. It is not just the synonymous ones, but definitely it is one of the major determinants. So it will be hampered. And as I was pointing out, that in the formal sector, given the earlier policies like maternity act, then also there was no protection for wage equality. So there were cases even in formal sector that women were being given less wage. So the crisis was already there. The gender issues were already there. So on the top of this, it was, if we juxtapose the criticality of COVID, the women empowerment, women labor force participation is going to be badly affected in India. And particularly so for the more socially backward classes.
So you mean there is going to be an interaction of class, caste, gender, etc., to create the cumulative impact of pandemic on people?
Yeah, I mean, that's I'm okay. Sorry, Orijita, you go ahead. I will add something to this.
Yes, please.
No, I mean, since I'm from outside looking at it. Oh boy, I think India is going to. It's terrible. All this religion, caste, this, that. I mean, India has been far more divided in the last 3 months than what it was already. Most countries abroad are actually finding ways to come together. And there is a realization, it's not any particular communities or worker occupation groups disease. Wherever it may originate from, it is everybody's problem. And there is no other way but coming together. In India, it's a very, very absurd situation. For example, what I hear and read, and you guys probably know better, there are hundreds of different lockdown rules, starting from central government to state government to district to your local housing society. My goodness. And then there are all kind of things. If you are Muslim, there is a sort of tendency to say, we went to Delhi, that Tablighi congregation or not, whether you are coming from lower caste, if you live in slums, there are all kind of different ways people try to identify the risk. Now, this is absurd. And then you have the private healthcare sector. This is a terrible thing going on. if you have money, you can actually book an ICU in case, and a ventilator in case you fall sick, right? Now, this is the first thing that should be stopped. And the private healthcare is a disaster in a pandemic environment. But there we are. And India, like 2-3 other countries in the world, are facing serious leadership problem. But that's something you can't do. You have to live with it and see where it goes. But yes, the caste and etc. is going to play a big problem, and all kind of divisions. Yeah.
And this is the last question, and this is to Indrani, ma'am. Ma'am, you have been pointing about incentive to people for quarantine centers, etc. But in West Bengal, where society is an important part and social taboo is a factor, thus this incentive will work because categorization of people as COVID patient will lead to isolation in society. And please switch on your mic, please. And please switch on your mic.
Yes, no, I was actually pointing out that the government order is that if you are tested positive, then you are supposed to stay in the government provided quarantine centers. Now, the thing is that COVID is a typicality of the disease is that you may not have the severity. So you may have a very mild kind of exposition, you may not show any symptoms at all. And then you are infected or tested positive means that you have to be very alert for the society. So there's an externality problem because you are not bearing or not feeling any pain of the disease. But if it is because of your presence, if you just mix out with outside, if your exposure to others will actually trigger the infection. So that way, it is an incentive problem. So I actually tried to argue that it is the government, therefore, should come out with certain incentives in order to enable the people, especially from the poor background, to report their problems, to report their, or enabling them for testing. And therefore, and for that, they should be priced. So that means some kind of quarantine allowance should be given because entire effort from the government side is the reflection which we are noticing is from the supply side, nothing from the demand side. So so why the poor people who has a huge opportunity cost of losing weight will be coming and reporting if he has some mild symptoms to the government centers. So that is actually the incentive problems. You have to give some incentives in order to enable them to report. So the information, so I try to argue these things from on the basis of the problem which is inherent in the information disclosure. So that is, I don't know whether I was able to satisfy that.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Regarding the test, I would like to say there's a huge subjectivity which is involved because if you go through the ICMR websites, you will find that every week, not even every week, within the week also there are new and new notifications. So there is no benchmark. So something they are saying today and then they are changing it in the next day. And then this is a centralized notification and every state according to their own interest, they're also devising something. So in terms of implementation, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So states which are having the election, like Delhi, which is already having the elections, have a better incentive to project the disease and then go for the targeted approach, whereas some of the states like Bihar or West Bengal, who are actually in a very shorter period of time will be facing the elections, may be having a very lesser political will to disclose the information. So they are also, so therefore the standardization of the protocols are very much missing. So that means who are to be tested. That means if somebody tested positive, whether it is an immediate family to be tested, whether those who are showing some symptoms to be tested, whether the contacts who are the immediate contacts, not even within the family but outside in the neighborhood to be tested. So all these things are based on lot of subjectivity. So that actually make our data very much unreliable.
Thank you so much, ma'am. On a closing remark, I would just request each of the professor to give us a view about the future ahead of India and its people among all this uncertainty. I will start with Vibhas, sir. Closing remark on this.
Oh boy. Hey, how much time do you want me to speak on this? It can go on
Closing
forever.
remark.
Right? No, but okay, maybe a few minutes, right? Unfortunately, we are in a situation, it's very hard to say. It is like you are in the middle of an intense storm. And until and unless the storm, gender, caste, etc., we should not forget. One death means you are losing one of your countrymen. And that has to be taken into account. So next 1 year is going to be very, very tough. I'm more on the kind of skeptic side. I think overall in the economy after 1 year will gradually come back, and my feeling is the informal sector that will actually do better than the formal sector, because the formal sector is so much dependent on the international market now. Exports, IT jobs, although service sector will do, I mean, IT long distance services will be fine, but we are so much globally connected. This pandemic is going to play out for at least 1 year, and we don't know about what's going to happen with vaccine. So the formal sector will be affected. The informal sector works on a completely different logic. I think we often think informal sector as an imperfect sector where the law has not reached, or they just think they like. But we should not forget that this is a sector that has probably come up as a natural response to uncertainty and risk that affect our life every day, and that India has lived through in the past. So this sector has a lot of insurance inbuilt in it. People will be able to survive. This will not provide a great income, but very poor people will be able to survive unless there is a severe agricultural production problem, drought, etc. There will be a problem of the linkage between informal and formal. That's because the migrant workers who have come back to villages are not going to go back to Delhi or Mumbai anytime soon. So these kind of supply linkages will be a problem. Supply chain issues will be a problem, and that will take some time to get sorted out. So next 1 year, in my view, is going to be quite problematic, quite difficult. Is this going to be 5% recession? Is it 7%? Some people are quoting even 12%. I don't know. But definitely we will feel huge problems. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Indrani ma'am, any quoting note on the future of health structure in Indian economy? Hello. Indrani ma'am, can you hear me? Hello. Remark.
I think I've already spoken too much. So closing remark should be little. Mr. Shah has already said that the next couple of years is bad. So we have to live with COVID for some time. But after that, let us hope that the economy, there is a some positive boost in the economy, especially the vaccination, the vaccines, which are actually some very optimistic pictures are coming from the different parts of the globe that the vaccines are at least 10 10-fold research are showing very positive and hopeful scenarios. So if the vaccine comes, India is having some comparative advantage because it is a leading producer of vaccines, other child vaccines and other vaccines. So a couple of Indian companies are with international collaborations. So that front we are in a better side, but we don't know that what will happen after because the vaccine in the initial stage are all patent protected. So once it comes to the implementations and distribution stage, what would be the pricing? Who will be the receiver? Because there's a huge demand. Whether the supply will be able to cater to the demand, and then from the public distribution aspect, that how would be the targeting taking place? So those things are some matter of some serious planning. So I would like to just wrap up here.
Thank you, ma'am. Arjita ma'am. Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
I have unmuted.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Actually, if you look at our lives, I think COVID has been our a structural break in our life. So we need to look at the hello.
Yes, ma'am. You are there. We can hear you.
We need to find out that what are the changes that are going to come. We are pondering over it, but on a optimistic viewpoint, I would like to say that
Ma'am. Ma'am. Hello. Ma'am, you are losing your connection. I think we have lost internet connection. One of the biggest curse of this online seminars and webinars. But luckily, internet connection, West Bengal electricity, everybody provided us with time so that we could have our main discussions. Arjita ma'am, have you joined? I think ma'am has disconnected for some reason. I will request Dr. Melissa Khatun. She is Assistant Professor of Department of Economics of Aliah University to join us and provide us with a concluding remark and a vote of thanks. Melissa ma'am.
Shashi,
Yes, ma'am.
can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. You're audible.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, the respected Registrar, sir, all the HODs and faculties and staff of the Aliah University. I would like to thank the eminent speaker, Professor Saha, Professor Roy Chaudhuri, and Professor Datta to share their innovative suggestions and ideas with us. Thanks to Mr. Shashibhushan Mishra, Head of the Department of Economics, for organizing such an interesting webinar for discussion. Thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professors. Thank you, all the participants. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And for those who are inquiring about the feedback form, it will be mailed shortly. Please be patient. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving your time. We'll be taking a leave today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Indrani, say hi to Prabal.